Welcome to Shelter and Solidarity, a deep dive with artists and activists during this ongoing COVID pandemic. I'm your host, Joe Ramsey, Zoom casting with you here from Dorchester, Massachusetts, on the south side of Boston. Now in, I don't even know what month it is. I guess we can call it the second year of this pandemic. We are here on Zoom, and if you do have, if you are on our live Zoom audience, please do make sure to mute yourself so that we don't see anything that we're not planning to see. Here we have but here in our first 2021 show in Shelter and Solidarity, our 31st show, we're so lucky to be joined by three terrific guests and a great respondent to explore a theme that I know many of us can relate to, the theme being socialist hopes versus American realities. In the yawning gap between the crisis of the economy, the environment, the very survival of the species on one hand, and the ruling class responses on the other, is there space for socialist solutions and the movements that can deliver them? How do we build bridges between the actuality we are faced with in the United States of America in 2021 and that world that we want to see and that we believe humanity, in fact, needs to thrive and perhaps even to survive? We'll be pursuing these and other questions with a thoughtful and diverse group of activist intellectuals, starting with Eljeer Hawkins. Eljeer, so people can see you at home, welcome.
How you doing?
Good. We can only see people when we hear them here on Shelter and Solidarity in the world of Zoom. Eljeer Hawkins is a community and anti-war activist born and raised in Harlem, New York, member of Socialist Alternative for the past 21 years, the entire 21st century in SA and the Committee for Workers International. He has toured internationally, invited to address audiences from South Africa to Ireland, Brazil, and Belgium on the Black struggle in the United States. Eljeer has been involved in the recent Black Lives Matter movement, as well as the fight for the $15 an hour minimum wage. And currently, Eljeer is a non-union healthcare worker in New York City and has published in venues including Truth Out. Again, Eljeer, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Our next speaker to kick things off will be Liza Featherstone, returning to Shelter and Solidarity, actually after a relatively brief respite. You actually on our last show of 2020, and you're back for more already. I guess you don't know how to say no to a good Zoom cast, huh? Liza, it's so great to have you back and to see you again. Liza, for those who don't know, is a journalist based in New York City as well, a contributing writer to The Nation magazine as well as to Jacobin, a proud member, last time we checked anyway, in Democratic Socialists of America. She's co-author of Students Against Sweatshops and the author of Selling Women Short, the landmark battle for workers' rights at Walmart, as well as Divining Desire, Focus Groups, and the Culture of Consultation. She is also the editor of False Choices, a collection on the faux feminism of Hillary Clinton. Liza, thanks for coming back. Can we actually hear you? Make sure we can hear you when you, yeah.
Yeah, we were all muted, but now I'm.
There you go. Oh, you were coercively muted. Sometimes
yes,
we bring out the big guns here on these rowdy crowds, these socialist crowds. Liza, it's great to have you back. Last but certainly not least, we have Kazembe Balagun joining us for the first time. Kazembe, it's great to finally meet you, not just over the phone and not just over various text and digital platforms. And again, Kazembe, we can only hear you when you're unmuted. Kazembe is a cultural historian, activist, writer, from Harlem, New York City. From 2018 to 2013, he served as the Director of Outreach and Education at the Brecht Forum in New York, where he helped bring together performance art, LGBT history, film, and jazz with Marxism and the Black radical tradition. He is a frequent contributor to the Indypendent, the Indypendent with a Y out of New York City, where he published the last interview of Octavia Butler, and most recently, he has an essay in a book volume, Finally Got the News, The Printed Legacy of the Radical Left. He was a member of the Red Channel's Film Collective and has presented at Metrograph, Brooklyn Academy of Music, and other events. He currently serves as the project manager with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung out of New York and is working on a project looking at uncovering the history of the Black Commune. Finally, our fourth guest will be in the form of a respondent, also returning to Shelter in Solidarity, Victor Wallace, my dear Boston area-based, Somerville-based comrade. Victor, the longtime managing editor of the journal Socialism and Democracy, as well as the author of at least 3 books, including Red Green Revolution, a book about science, technology, and eco-socialist transformation, as well as Democracy Denied, a terrific book I recently assigned in a class I taught at UMass Boston. And last but not least, his most recent book, which I highly recommend, on socialist practice, theories, and histories. Victor, thanks for joining us once again.
Thanks, Joe. It's good to be here.
Great. So I want to kick it off and just turn it over to this great panel of guests. And as always, I want to remind everyone on this call, we will be opening things up 45 minutes to an hour in. So your questions, comments can go in the chat box now, and you'll have a chance to speak them aloud, or have me or another moderator speak them aloud if you'd like to participate in the discussion. But first, let's go in the order I introduced you. Go to Eljeer first. And Eljeer, I mean, this really is the question for all of you. I asked you to just kind of step into the big picture of 2021 as we start this year. This year, so much has happened already, even since we planned this show. The storming of the Capitol was not something we had anticipated when we cast this show. We weren't even sure if it would be Biden or Trump in the White House. But we know a little more now, but there's still a lot that is uncertain. So, Eljeer, how does 2021 look to you? How do you see, as a socialist activist, writer, organizer, how do you see the dangers, the opportunities, and the obstacles to achieving those opportunities from a left perspective entering this new year?
I see 2021 as a continuum of 2019 and certainly 2020. 2019 highlighted by the fact of social struggle around the world, rebellions, counter-revolution in a number of countries. In 2020, many people would have thought, what about the United States? Where will we see the United States in this process? And certainly with COVID-19, the George Floyd rebellion, the economic recession, the great economic recession, I think it has brought to life a number of key elements that I think the socialist left and the workers' movement will have to begin to address in a more serious way, from climate to education, jobs, and healthcare. And so the idea of the socialist alternative, I think, is alive and well. But I think the discussion has to be about strategy now, about political perspectives, analysis. Where does the ascendancy of Biden really represent not just what he wants to do, but what is the state of the developing socialist left, and where is the labor movement today? That will be the key decisive factor, I would argue, in the sense of really reshaping what 2021 will be, in the sense of social struggle, of organizing, of strategy and approach that puts the working class at the center of events. And I think if we don't really grapple with that, I think we're going to be prone to making some really difficult and problematic mistakes going forward.
Eljeer, could I ask you to elaborate just a little bit before we go to Liza on what you see as some of those dangers, or that the left might make if it does not put the working class at the center? I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on what you see, what it means to put the working class at the center in the way that you just asserted.
Right. I mean, if we could think about the George Floyd rebellion, the first iteration of BLM from 2014 to 2016 certainly gave us a number of reforms, like body cameras in 24 states throughout the nation. And certainly the George Floyd rebellion really began to heighten the question around police budgets and budgetary concerns and priorities, public spending and social spending for working people and the poor, particularly that of Black and brown youth and workers. Since the rebellion, we've seen the movement at this juncture in the ebb, in the low moment. And in many ways, we saw how corporate America gave out basically $2 billion to various BLM affiliate organizations or racial justice networks. And so in many ways, those budgetary concerns around police budgets was left in the hands, basically, of the faux progressives of various cities and states. It was left in the hands of city councils, like in Minneapolis and Seattle, that did not take on the demands of the movement. And in many ways, the movement is in maturity in the sense of developing the type of leadership, the type of sustaining organization necessary to take those type of demands into the community itself, among Black workers, among Black youth, to have a dialogue. How do we actually win a 50% decrease in police budgets here in New York? It's a $5.9 billion budget. And frankly, what we got at the end of the rebellion was just basically $1 billion that was just turned around and moved around, but nothing concrete came out of that in the sense of victories for the coming out of the rebellion.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Eljeer. I think I appreciate you elaborating that. It reminds me as we transition to Liza here also, of course, the Biden administration has pronounced a racial equity, agenda, right, across departments, and of course has received a lot of press for its various appointments, right? It's historically diverse appointments to various branches of government. Liza, I'd like to pitch it to you, not to hem you in make you be the one that talks about the Biden administration, although you have published on it recently, in at least the initial left gestures or left act, I don't want to say just gestures, but some of the early moments of the Biden administration have perked up interest among some on the left. How do you analyze the moment we're in? If you want to address the Biden administration off the bat, that's great. But if you'd like to frame it more broadly, I certainly don't want to hem you in that way. How do you read 2021 as we are still at the end of the beginning of this new year? Make sure to unmute.
Yeah. So, first of all, I would say in some ways, our task as socialists is always the same. That we need to build our organizations. That's almost, I think, one of the most important things you can do right now is, if you're a socialist, join an organization, any good and thriving socialist organization, and help build it. If you're in a workplace, and there's an opportunity to organize your workplace. These are the things that we always need to do, and we live in such an interesting time that sometimes we don't, talk about, that we don't necessarily talk enough about the fact that the things that we need to do, there are certain things we need to do that are just constant, the things that we always need to do. That said, there are a lot of really particular things going on at this moment. I think the storming of the Capitol is important. I think that there really is a grassroots fascist movement in the United States with some real friends within the state. We've just ejected through the democratic process the top friend in the form of Donald Trump, but I don't think he's clearly not the only one. There are quite a few in Congress as well, and I think that's a serious challenge, and I think that I certainly don't think anybody here feels this way, but I think there are certainly some on the left that view that as kind of a distraction or a liberal problem, or or just But make no mistake, they're coming for us. I mean, these white nationalists are not just, um, they're not, they don't just perceive Nancy Pelosi and the neoliberal Democrats as their enemy. They're very animated by a hatred of people of color and women, and also socialists. Socialists and socialism are always an animating enemy for fascists, and in as much as they hate Nancy Pelosi or Joe Biden or people like that, it is because they fantasize that those people are socialists. So they, I mean, I think that, we see this in the sort of particular way that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was targeted by the violence on January 6th. I'm sure Eljeer will talk later about the threats that Kashama Sawant receives from these far-right elements. And so, we really need to think seriously about what are our, how do we as socialists respond, and and honestly not spend so much time worrying about their free speech rights on Twitter. I mean, that's really that to me genuinely is a side issue. Other things that are really particular about this moment are, yes, the Biden administration. Having the Biden administration in power instead of the Trump administration is not a triumph of the socialist left, but it is a triumph of many, many grassroots activists, left of center, who worked very hard to make this happen. Many, like, and many of them much more progressive than the Biden administration. And it is a significant, it's I think it's significant that by 7 million votes or so, the far rightist in the White House lost. I think that's significant and encouraging. And I also think that that it's pretty significant that the first few days of the Biden, or first week or so of the Biden administration has been marked by a lot of moves that are not as centrist or right wing as I would have expected. There's if you look at his executive orders, almost all of them are things that we on the left would consider good. They are almost all rollbacks of things that Trump did. But we know that Democrats in the past don't really spend that much time undoing Republican policies unless there's a significant political reason in the form of progressive forces on the ground and world historical crises. Which brings me to my next point. We face several of those right now. We have a deadly global pandemic, and a related to that, a almost equally deadly recession, and we're also facing climate change as so existential a threat that even the bourgeoisie is having to acknowledge it, and find and make some gestures toward addressing it. So I think that these are, this is some pretty serious context. I'm intrigued, Joe, that you framed this discussion as with a versus in the title. I wouldn't say it's versus. I think this is actually a good moment for socialism. I think crises are a good crises are often a very good time for the left to advance. They They give us a lot of opportunity to work in coalition with non-socialists, both against the right and to pressure the center. And they also give us a lot of opportunity to make the case against capitalism and build the socialist movement. So socialism, I would quarrel with socialism versus American reality. I think American reality might well be a socialist opportunity in 2021.
Yeah, and I mean, you get my vote. Yeah, I mean, I think we could, and I don't know that we had unity even among our editorial board on the verses. I think there's different ways to frame, but there's a dialectic there for sure, right? I mean, I guess the question is, we want to foreground the way in which we need to address the obstacles as well to realizing those hopes, to concretizing them, and the way in which the concretizing of those hopes might require forms that are new and novel and not necessarily what socialists often sometimes in earlier moments have assumed would be the manifestation of those hopes. But yeah, I appreciate that. We always like to think about language as well. Let's bring in Kazembe here. I mean, there's a lot on the table already, Kazembe, and you should feel free to respond to anything that's been said. But I'd also love to hear your kind of independent take on this moment we are, again, what I'm calling the tail end of the beginning of 2021. What is the outlook, as a left organizer operating out of New York City, but obviously thinking in broad national and international terms, as far as I understand your work? What's your read on this moment we're in? What the dangers are that haven't already been articulated by our comrades on the call, and what you see as the opportunities of this moment, as well as maybe obstacles that need to be addressed to achieve those opportunities from your perspective?
Yeah, first of all, again, thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful to be here. Wonderful to be here with such great friends and comrades. I want to shout out my old boss, Liz Mistress, who's on the call today. I just saw her.
Oh, hey, Liz.
It was awesome. Hey, Liz, I see you.
Hey,
I was scrolling through and stuff like that. It was we used to do this back in the day at the Brecht Forum down in the village, except that, we used to have wine right afterwards. Right? So we can maybe have some wine after. You got your wine together, so that's good to know. I guess for me, from my perspective, I mean, I guess I feel a few things. I feel that, I do feel that, I always tell people all the time that, when Dr. King went out to the March in Washington, he said, he didn't say, I have a plan. He said, I have a dream, right? And, and he provided a strategic vision, and a vision that really kind of connected the dots between, connected ourselves to nature, to commons. He talked about rivers. He talked about mountains. He talked about a lot of things in which, we shared. And I think that, what I really feel in this moment right now is about like this idea around what we really do share in this particular moment. We've seen 15 to 25, we see close to 25 million people in the streets shouting Black Lives Matter, saying as a universal hashtag, saying against racist oppression, and we've seen a movement that, that's kind of jolted, someone like Joe Biden to have to take on these radical ideas, right? And, and let's face it, I mean, Joe Biden has a very low bar because basically if Joe Biden just simply governs, that's just already that's a win, right? Because we haven't had, I mean, if you think about it on a deep level, one of the things that, one of the reasons we're in this predicament right now is because just the lack of governance, right? Donald Trump did everything he could do in his possible power to strip the government of all of its functionality, to treat it like an ATM machine, to even the way in which he even engaged in the pardon process, just ban out all his friends and all this other stuff, and and that's across the board. So that kind of fraction that we see in society, was a result of that lack of governance, that lack of ability. But we can't really stop there, right? We need the vision, right? We need to be able to really articulate what what the horizon is for not just ourselves, but for the whole entire world. And so that means that for a large part of it is that we acknowledge the problem. We acknowledge the fact that progressive forces are facing a global right. This is a right wing that's not just lodged within the United States, but it's large within like Brazil, in India, in Great Britain. We realize that, this right is one that has a very sophisticated communicative strategy that's really about the big microphone. Those of us who are in New York City from back in the day realize that this goes all the way back to talk radio, and now talk radio has kind of manifested itself into like the internet, and now into the conspiracy theories, and that, in similar ways in which QAnon works is a similar way in which like you see conspiracy theories working in like places like Brazil on WhatsApp. So what is our strategic vision? What do we want to build at this particular moment? What is it we want to see? And I think that this is a time for us not to shrink down. This is not a time for us not to be small in our vision, to settle for the crumbs. I think it's a time for us to be like big, and to really make bold declarations around that, that Liza had said very eloquently, that crises can actually be good, right? You know what I'm saying? And this is a fact. I agree with you, Joe, that this is actually a beginning. In terms of the verses part, I thought I was on verses. I thought I was on the rap show, but I didn't bring my best verse. But I did say this, man. I think the American reality is the only thing that's stopping us is our belief in each other. So like when Bernie Sanders like loses in South Carolina because they tell African Americans that white people won't vote for something that Black people will get, which was a line that was kind of used. That's something that we have to fight in terms of the imagination, right? In terms of that united front that we all want to have and want to see. And so I think that that's part of the fight against that American reality, because American reality is always about holding back the forces of history. It's always about like telling us what we can and cannot get. And let me just say that too, that the brother Elijah would also talk about this as well. But anti-socialism and anti-communism is connected to anti-Blackness.
Yeah.
Saying that the two go hand in hand.
Yeah.
So back in the day when we were talking about Obama not being a citizen, he was also called a socialist. He was also called a communist, So these two things work in tandem. So we have a united front against these racist forces that are also anti-socialist, because because at the end of the day, these people were never happy with the end of the Civil War, never happy with the outcome of the Civil War. They were never happy with the women's liberation movement. They were never happy with the gay movement. That's why they're out here protesting for these ugly ass statues. What I'm saying? But I think in a large sense, our vision is much bigger and grander, and I think it's much more beautiful. And that means like universal jobs for all, universal health care, inclusive of the unmet demands of Black labor, and freedom of for our immigrant brothers and sisters. And I think that that's what we have to speak into existence right now in terms of this kind of a socialist moment, possibility, hopefully prophecy that we're living in at the moment.
Kazembe, I find your words really moving. I mean, a number of things that you said, but that last phrase, one of the last phrases you use, speak into existence, which I think captures something powerful. And also it does make me reflect back on, the comment about the title of the show, which one of my producers pointed out to me. We did put a question mark at the end of that provocative title, but actually, but not to be silly about it. I mean, Kazembe, you're referring to American reality. I mean, it very much seems like a reality that needs to be put in quotation marks. You know what I mean? Like the ways in which American subjects or, good American are taught to think what is possible and what is not, right? The way in which, and an educator, I can't help but make just a very brief comment before we go back to Eljeer, and hear a little more of a kind of on the ground report on some of the right wing backlash that your organization, I know Eljeer, is at the forefront of fighting in Seattle. But this idea, how many times have I been in a classroom of people in person or on Zoom, and everyone in the room basically agrees, yeah, we need to make some big change. There should be more, we should challenge and socialize media, or we should overthrow capitalism. But then, you ask the question, okay, so why don't we make it happen? And then students will say, oh, but nobody else out there will think that's possible. right? Like there's a way in which it's like very American to be like, think that like, oh, you can handle the truth maybe, but nobody else can. So you might as well not even bother raising it. So that's why I feel like that phrase you just made about speaking into existence seems to be very powerful. This like the question of how do we smash or transmute or melt away this sense of impossibility that is actually even in contradiction with our own better selves, our own better knowledge. Kazembe, I spoke over you there for a moment. You want to respond to that, and we'll go back to Eljeer?
Oh no, I mean, I'm just gonna respond to like the semantics of it. I mean, you talk about quotation marks and like, you know, and question marks and stuff like that. And I'm always like, you know, when I was growing up in Harlem, you know, like Eljeer is my Harlem homeboy. I was on 155th, and I think, you know, I don't know what street he was on, but like, you know, like I used to like, you know, they used to say to me that, you know, they were like, I was dyslexic, and it turns out like I just read in between the words. But one of the things I always thought about in this period right now is that, you know, Donald Trump always used the period. Like, you know what I'm saying? He says Donald Trump's like language is very choppy and very much like, you know, cutting off a train of thought. You know what I'm saying? So he was like bad, too bad, loser. You know what I'm saying? The way in which
right, sad, like, stupid, yeah.
Stupid, you know what I'm saying? And he would cut off like a way of thought. And like, you know, and I always argue with people that we need to go from the Donald Trump period to what I call the James Baldwin comma, right? And James Baldwin, who was an elegant Black gay civil rights writer, also socialist, right, used a comma, right? And the comma is about polyrhythm, is about both and, is about like a level in terms of like, you know, accepting contradictions, accepting the fact that things could be, you know, one way and also another way at the same time. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that that's the way in which we have to start thinking about some of our politics in terms of the ways in which we kind of like meet ourselves in the ways we be. And so I think that, you know, it's a beautiful time because I feel like there's a lot of potential out there. But I think that, like you said, it's a matter of like building those layers. And like, I'm sorry, like I feel sometimes like I'm bad about this because then like I feel like I can say it as an artist, and then I can look at people like Liza and Eljeer and be like, y'all help me figure out how to the final details and stuff like that. So I'm gonna leave it to my brother over here. He's gonna tell me how to do it. I'm sorry, bro.
No, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speak for anybody, but I don't hear any need for apologies. I really appreciate the way you bring it back to also not only the question of content, but like how we think, right? And the kind of cultural questions. And because I do think sometimes the things that shut down thought and possibilities aren't necessarily a matter of disagreement, but also a way that things are expressed and perceived. You know, I think that especially in a media saturated culture like ours, that is important. And thank you for that, Kazembe. Eljeer, I'd like to kick it back to you. I know that you've been involved. I mean, Liza and Kazembe both spoke about the right wing offensives, neo-fascist movements, grassroots, friends in high places, global networks. I know that you have been involved, your organization, your primary organization has been very involved in fighting one of these right-wing attacks, which it may be on folks' radar, but I want to make sure it is. Could you give us, your take and a report on what's been going on in Seattle and in terms of the support, the defense, and the attacks upon, one of the higher profile local socialist elected leaders, Kshama Sawant? What's the deal out there, Eljeer, and what lessons are you drawing from that ongoing campaign?
Yes, I mean, when we think of the rise of the hard right, when we think of right-wing populism, its birth really flows from the fact that we've had 40 years of neoliberalism. We've had a Democratic Party that has been unable and have aided and abetted the type of conditions that exist among the working class and poor, and particularly that of the white working class and poor in the different segments and regions of the country, of the nation. And so when we think of what is happening in Seattle, it's an outgrowth of a response, certainly by an independent socialist like Kshama Sawant, a member of Socialist Alternative, that from the very moment she took office elected in 2013 and inaugurated in 2014, up to the very moment that she's still in office, she has been linked with social movements and social struggle of the working class and poor of Seattle, and that she has used her office really as a bullhorn, as a platform for those struggles, say I'm not just a legislator and I'm not using my city council seat in the Seattle City Council as a career ladder boosting exercise. And in fact, I consider myself a workers' representative. I take the average wage of a worker, and everything else is donated back into the movement to build movements, to build social struggle, to build the capacity of the working class to fight for the things that they need and want. So from the very beginning of the Fight for 15, Seattle becoming the first city to have a $15 minimum wage, all the way through BLM, all the way through renters' rights, against the fossil fuel corporations, tax Amazon, which we were successful last year in instituting, that brought $240 million per year to deal with the question of affordable housing and the housing crisis in Seattle. And now today, there's a right-wing grouping that have launched a recall campaign against Sharma, led by Egan Orion. He was the Amazon candidate of 2019, led by Martin Seelig, who's a Trump supporter and a billionaire ICE landlord. You have from the Republican Party, John McCain, who's a former U.S. attorney under George W. Bush, and also this is the kicker about by a bipartisan approach. He is close friends with the mayor Durkin, who is a Democrat. In fact, we would say a corporate Democrat. And then you have figures like Airbnb CFO David Stevenson and Merrill Lynch Senior VP Matt Westfall. So what you have the corporate Democrats, you have corporate America, and you have the right wing going on the offensive to get Sharma out of office. Why? It's not just because she's just a socialist. It's because she's an effective socialist, that she uses her office really to amplify and organize working people and the poor. And because she's been able to win victories, that is the big danger. That is why she must be taken out. And what we have done over the past period is that we have launched an offensive campaign against the recall. Right now, the decision has not been made by the Washington State Supreme Court that the recall can go forward. But what we have done, we've launched our campaign to build up the type of support among labor activists, DSA members, public officials, known scholars and organizers, and begin to say, in order to defeat the recall, we must amplify the fact that if they're able to get Sharma Sawant out of office, 150 DSA members who are in public office should be very, very weary, because they will go after them at some point, certainly with different type of approach, but certainly they will go after them. Why? Because particularly if you use your platform as a public representative, you can and also gain victories, material victories for working people. You are absolute danger to the system, to the status quo. And my last point is that Sharma is not a Democrat. She's an independent socialist belonging to a socialist organization who's democratically accountable to the movement and to the organization she's a member of. And so it raises the question around, can we continue to use the Democratic Party as an instrument to run campaigns and initiatives, particularly around points around this forced to vote question around Nancy Pelosi and the squad. And so these things raise a lot of questions that we have to talk about. I think Sharma is a great example of what independent working class politics can look like on a local level and even on a statewide level as well.
Yeah, really interesting, Eljeer. And just for those who are following along here live, there's been some links in the chat box for Solidarity, the Sharma Sawant Solidarity, SharmaSolidarity.org. We encourage you to link into those networks if you're not already there. I mean, I think you raised some other questions to me, and we appreciate that report, Eljeer. Also, the questions you raised about what it means for the struggle of the left's relationship to the Democratic Party. To what degree, can the progressive elements of the Democratic Party continue to be, kind of one to support left causes? To what degree is there the basis for splitting off some of those, left Democrats in another more independent direction? To what degree can left Democrats or even centrist Democrats be pushed in, as Liza has framed it, the context of crisis and a social movement on the street. But I think there's no way the comrades of this show, we can get around the question of the need to build independent left organization as well. Liza, I wonder if you could step into this, both not only the broader question of how you see this question of kind of what we often on the show frame in terms of the inside-outside question, right? Inside-outside sometimes understood as inside-outside electoral politics, but also in terms of inside-outside the Democratic Party in particular. I'm curious on your views on that theoretical, practical question, but also I'd love for you to give us also a report for those who haven't been following DSA's many successes, I know, including in your neck of the woods, Jabari Brisport, who we're still looking forward to having on the show at some point, who I believe you're close to, who is one of those successful stories, one of those 150 that Eljeer just mentioned. I'm curious, what your take on those successes are, also how the story of those successes also relates to the story of the threats that Kshama Sawant is facing. What can be learned from, the experience out in Seattle in terms of the DSA breakthroughs. There's a lot there, local and the broader, but I'd welcome your thoughts on any or all levels of that.
Yeah, well, I appreciated the update from Eljeer about the Kshama's situation, because I have been following it with interest. I think it has. I think that all socialists should be, eagerly attending to this story, and for news on how we can support her and Socialist Alternative in Seattle right now. As far as our, I mean, I guess I don't really think I think that the question of how socialists should relate to the Democratic Party is pretty situational. Like that, in the situations that I have been following in like in New York City, for example, we now have 6 socialists in the state legislature. And 5 of them are DSA, were DSA backed candidates, but one of them has just joined DSA's socialist electoral group. Emily Gallagher, we didn't endorse her, but she is with us. And the inside-outside strategy is really pretty serious in the context of NYC DSA. We don't just elect them and then send them off to make friends with the other Democrats, which I think is would be a pretty perilous strategy, and is sort of historically has been the main option. They meet every week with DSA members, our elected officials. The DSA is very much shaping the agenda that they're following in the legislature. We don't think of it so much as, when we had just one legislator, the model was, there was sort of an accountability model, which is, she would do things that people didn't like, and DSA members would yell at her on Twitter about it. And, that was pretty much the model of accountability. And that's not very good, right? I mean, that's like not very effective. And so the model has really changed. So that DSA is, DSA has a legislative agenda. They meet with the elected officials every week. The DSA is also helping these elected officials to use their constituent offices as organizing points. So really organizing for socialism and democratic socialist priorities out of their constituent offices while providing constituent services. So it's a very, it's a pretty, I mean, as inside outside strategies go, it's pretty layered. Like the relationship between the elected officials and the movement is pretty is pretty intimate at this moment. You know, I see a lot of different. There are always a lot of different ways that this can play out, and of course, the Democratic Party is you know, I mean, is obviously not in its own on its own ever going to be a force for socialist change, but as a vehicle for building socialist power, our particular experience in New York City has shown that we have come a lot further this way and built a lot more socialist organization and won more concrete gains for working people than we had in the past when we attempted to run candidates on the Green Party platform, for example. I'm not saying that that can't work, but our particular, and I really don't have any grand theory about it, but our particular experience is this has worked a lot better for our organization. We have come a lot further in terms of what I would say would be the two main things that a socialist organization can do, which is to grow and introduce more people to socialism and to win concrete gains for working people that make all of our lives better. We've just been able to do that better by using the Democratic Party as a tool. That is not to say that that road is not fraught with peril, and that is also not to say that you can't do it differently. I think it's really interesting and great to see what Kazembe and the Socialist Alternative have done, and I'd love to see them do more and, you know, build more inside outside power.
Yeah, Liza, thanks so much for that. I mean, it's difficult for me. I want to go to Kazembe in just a moment as another New Yorker to get Kazembe's sense of this too, in terms of, but I wanted to ask you first, and then to Victor Wallace, our respondent, who I know has profound thoughts on some of these questions. Liza, could you, you give such a great, like, kind of layered, like, framework, you know, for thinking here, which I really appreciate. Just to sharpen things up a little bit for folks at home, would you say what are like 1, 2, or 3 things that concretely the socialist bloc of these kind of New York elected officials now, and of course their supported movement and organizations are pushing for right now that maybe that wouldn't have been possible before? Like, in what sense has, even though it's not a majority or anything, but having 6 socialist, you know, elected officials in that, you know, and that you mentioned, what does that mean? You know, what is something that wouldn't have been possible that now is perhaps possible, not guaranteed, but possible because of that change, just to concretize things a little bit. And then I'd like to get Kazembe's thoughts on, you know, on the lay of the land in New York more broadly,
Yeah.
and then maybe Victor for a kind of a broader theoretical point as well. Liza.
Yeah, well, I definitely want to hear their thoughts as well. So, I mean, with only one socialist legislator, we were able to win a we were a number of huge victories for tenants. More the biggest set. It was the first time that tenants had won more than a defensive victory in like 30 years in New York. Like there were the rent protections and were vastly expanded. And that was with one socialist legislator, and we won those gains in 2019. But now we do think, even though there are only 6 and there are lots of other people in state government, we do think that it has really shifted the horizon of possibility, combined with the other crises I mentioned. I mean, you know, it's not just that we have some socialists in the legislature, but also we have a deadly pandemic, a horrific recession, and these urgent crises that need to be addressed, climate crisis as well. Some things that that are seeming newly possible as a result. Um, the the taxing the rich um, is always always very politically fraught in New York City because our ruling class is extremely well organized. We have a lot of rich people, and they really don't want to share their wealth, as rich people generally don't. So it's a really very concrete and basic class struggle issue. It is not only a socialist issue. We have seen liberals since Adam Smith have been in favor of taxing the rich, but in America, it has taken on any kind of redistribution has been vigorously resisted, and so it has taken it probably does take socialists to win this. So we see more concrete steps toward toward potentially taxing the rich. The other thing that we're seeing much more on the horizon on the horizon of closer possibility is the New York Health Act, which is a bill to do single payer in New York. There is a assemblyman who has Richard Godfried, who has been in the assembly for decades and wrote the bill, the Healthcare Act, years ago. It's been in the legislature for a long time, he said recently on a call with the new DSA members, with the new DSA elected members, that if it passes, it will be thanks to all of us who voted and worked for these people. He has really felt like kind of a lonely voice in working for single payer, and it may be newly kind of on the horizon of possibility. Also, I mean, and I should say, like, people have been fighting for these things for years, but having socialists and having the possibility that a socialist and socialist organizations could primary the Democrats, because our primary campaigns have been very successful. I think all of those things add a little bit of force to the fight.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult not to draw an analogy to the national level and just think about the impact of the Bernie Sanders campaign within the Democratic Party, even though not a Democrat per se, versus the Ralph Nader campaign. I mean, I supported both of them, right? But it is, I mean, and again, I appreciate your comment about the need to be attuned to local environments. I don't want to make any sweeping generalizations. And I think it's been pointed out by one of our Facebook viewers, Ben Mansky, a regular on the show as well, that the same kind of attacks that have been directed at the overt socialists have also sometimes been directed at Green elected officials, where they've actually made grounds. Chuck Turner is a case here in Boston I'm familiar with based on my geography. He also mentions Natalie Johnson Lee in the Twin Cities, numerous Green elected officials in Madison, Brenda Conkle, for instance. Ben is not able to join us online, but he's on Facebook. Thank you, Ben. But I think it is food for thought, right? I mean, I think this question of the strategic opening of primarying, the primary as a strategic venue, I mean, it's something maybe we should even just do a show on the nuts and bolts of how you can challenge your shitty Democratic representative in these so-called blue states of Massachusetts. Kazembe, I'd like to kick it to you. As a New Yorker, as well as kind of visionary. I mean, Liza was speaking a little bit of your language too, in the sense of that expanding the horizon of the possible. I mean, what do you think of? I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot with, like, what's your view of the changes in terms of DSA's impact in New York, but more broadly, I mean, I'm curious what your view is on the relationship between street and social movement organizing more broadly and electoral struggle inside and outside the Democratic Party. If you want to kick that aside and talk about another way of transforming and expanding our sense of the possible, then I welcome that as well. But as a New Yorker, it's hard for me not to hard for me to not want to hear your take on developments locally in New York City. And then I'd like to get Victor Wallace in our conversation as well.
Well, I mean, I'll say this, and I'll try to take the hard question in terms of this. I'm coming in from the mainland of the Bronx, which is like, you know, I think Liza is like connected to down, like, you know, downtown in Brooklyn, and Eljeer, I think you're still in the Bronx, right? Or you might be uptown, you know. But any event, I'm on the mainland of the Bronx. Which is the mainland is connected to the United States. The only borough that's connected to the United States, right? To the United States mainland. And, you know, and it's a borough that I think that, you know, when from, you know, looking historically, you know, it produced like co-op city, right? Which is like where I'm sitting here right now, which is the world's largest cooperative housing development. You know, and then you have amalgamated houses, you know, that was founded by Sidney Hillman, which is a Jewish socialist. So these ideas, and, you know, you have people like Vita Marcantonio, you know, and Ben Davis. I mean, so the socialist tradition in politics goes a long way back in terms of like, you know, being impactful in terms of New York City. And then I think if you're taking it even further, you know, New York City and New York State has the highest level of union density, you know, and like various militant trade unions, 1199, you know, with a deep tradition in the service of feminism and Black liberation. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which all this kind of works. But I think that what happened today, what I think that was happening is that, and we've seen it in terms of like even the ways that Trump even called the cities. I mean, the cities have gone leftwards. I mean, there's been a rapid municipalization movement that's been going on for the past 20, 30 years that, you know, and you know, and there's been very smart grassroots folks who have been involved in that. And I really do want to give deep props to Kosama Sawant for being one of the first to actually do that, along with the late, great Chokwe Lumumba. They were the first socialist mayors and city council people to be starting this revolution. And so I think that, you know, we say, yes, absolutely, defend Kosama Sawant to the fullest. And I think that, you know, that kind of resonates back to the questions that we have now, because in terms of social movements, you know, the question around what a social movement is, social movements come out of a necessity of people who've been left out of political life. You know what I'm saying? So the largest social movement has always been the movement for Black freedom. You know what I'm saying? Followed by movements of gay liberation, followed by women liberation, because those are the movements in which they largely were left out of trade unions, left out of, you know, civic organizations, stuff like that. So they had to create something as a pressure point to do that. And I think that, you know, and so I think that given that, you know, there's always going to be an outside, there's always going to be a sense that, you know, that sense of democracy is going to go in. So that for me, the question of that democratic part and like that democratic socialist part of it means that everyone gets to participate in society as a citizen, you know. And I would say that, you know, one of the things that Trump tried to do was that Trump tried to create a situation where there was a very defined way of who was a citizen and who was not, right? And that's been the work of the Republican Party all along. And so in the South, you know, for example, you have a situation where like, you know, large swaths of Black people couldn't even vote. You know what I'm saying? Have been kicked off voting polls and stuff like that. But then you have like another contradiction in the society too, with like large amounts of people, for example, who've been part of the prison industrial complex and mass incarceration. You know what I'm saying? Their citizenship has always been kind of questioned, you know? And so, you know, and not to mention all of our immigrant brothers and sisters. So I think that, you know, at this point right now, as we're talking about socialism and these economic policies and what we need to do, we also need to talk about big D democracy, right? We need to talk about visions in which a big D democracy exists, in which all people are able to participate in full force. And that also means that the levels of power, the organic levels of power, are also leveled to people who are able to participate in grassroots, you know, decision making, you know, saying on a very basic level. And I think that that's going to be part of our strategic vision. So let's go forward with, like, you know, this socialist movement but let's not lose that you know what I'm saying, let's like, you know what I'm saying, at the risk of sounding ridiculous or provocative, let's recapture democracy, let's recapture democratic, you know what I'm saying, let's recapture that for people's ability to really participate fully in their lives all in one.
Yeah, Kazembe, I think that, I mean, powerfully put. I mean, is it possible to put it as a question, you know, that, and Victor, maybe to kick this to you too, that, I mean, your book, your first book that I read anyway, was called Democracy Denied. I encourage folks, I hope we can get a link in the chat box for that, to check it out, especially those who are teachers or who are in organization and trying to orient folks to thinking about these big questions in a clear but yet radical way. I highly recommend this. Very readable. It's actually 5 lectures that Victor gave in China that then were so sharp he published them as a book. But the question being, in some sense, to make democracy, even formal democracy, even so-called bourgeois democracy or electoral democracy, I don't want to call it bourgeois democracy, but you know, real within a country like this would almost be a big step towards socialism, even if it wasn't socialism in content explicitly. I know on Democracy Now! Earlier today, I heard there's, you know, reintroduction of legislation to give DC statehood, yeah. Right? And I mean, one of the things you have to kind of admit, even whatever the limits of a certain kind of woke liberalism is on, and a certain kind of Biden anti-racism, like we are getting some discourse about like, why is it that Wyoming has, you know, the same representation as California? Right. I mean, I was thinking as you were talking, Kazembe, I mean, how many people do we have locked in prison or locked out of voting rights because of prison? I mean, certainly we have more than the population of several of those underpopulated, predominantly white Midwestern states, right? I mean, how many senators should the brothers and sisters in prison get? You know, I mean, it seems to me, I mean, there is a way in which a certain notion of democracy, you're calling big D democracy, can actually be quite radical in its implications, especially in terms of the class and race composition of this republic, going all the way back to its, you know, its racist 3/5 of a person constitution, as well as this composition of the Senate, the Electoral College. I mean, I wonder, you know, about the possibility of, not just the possibility, but the actuality and the stirring of a kind of deep democracy movement that, whether it's socialist in name, maybe, or, you know, in form or whatever, in appearance, may have a real socialist potential, which I'm sure is conscious in some places and maybe not in others. I don't know if you want to respond to that a little bit before I go to Victor. I mean, you said it probably better than I did. I'm just kind of reflecting back what I heard with some particulars, but I know, Kazembe, do you have a thought on that before we kick it to Victor Wallace?
No, not really. I just want to listen to Victor Wallace. I can listen to Victor Wallace all day, actually.
Yeah, we need more Victor Wallace. Victor, great.
Thank you.
Also, let me say one other thing while Victor is composing his brilliant thoughts here. You have, not to put you on the spot or anything, we have some great folks I know and great folks I don't on this Zoom right now, and we'd love to hear your voice. And so we are just a little after 8, and after 8 we go to our audience for at least the next half hour, as long as our guests can stay with us, maybe even a little later, even if folks have to hop off at 8:30, as we promised them that a 90-minute event. But please do indicate you'd like to speak. Either post your question in the chat or just send us the message that you'd like to speak. And we want to get as many of your voices here. Speaking of democracy, we want to hear from you. Victor.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thank you, all of you. This has been a great conversation. I think that socialism has always been an extension of democracy, and that's what we're concretely thinking about now. I mean, I think the major issues have all been touched on, but I'd like to just mention a few things that have come up recently that bear on this. And the most alarming thing to me that hasn't been mentioned yet is the censorship being conducted by these various social platforms. They've completely, like one of them completely closed the account of the British Socialist Workers' Party, for example. And all the time, constantly, when I look up some reference on some issue, I run into a YouTube thing that says this has been taken down for some reason. Has nothing to do with that. So one of the things that we'll need to think about is, in fact, how we can develop a means of communication that's not dependent on these platforms, because we've depended a lot on them to get around the limitations of the mass media. And in a sense, up to now, it's been quite effective in allowing us to do that. And I think the communication of organizing things and even ideas that don't have to pass through the filter of the mass media has been great. But we're in danger of losing those platforms, and we'll have to establish them in some kind of new form. Related to that, and I think the pretext for the censorship is this idea of extremism. And extremism is one of those loose phrases that can be applied to whatever the user wants to apply it to. And of course, from the standpoint of the corporate establishment, extremism applies every bit as much, if not more so, to all of us as it does to the fascists who invaded the Capitol. And so we have to be very clear in our public statements about helping people to understand what's involved. I mean, in a sense, to me, I've always viewed the existing society as a society based on extremes, and that we're the ones who are trying to establish some kind of reasonable correspondence between what people are and what they can do, so that everybody, the whole idea of equality of opportunity in a radical sense, which means to a large extent equality of results, that you have to have real services, real benefits, that has always been a revolt against the extremity of the social polarization imposed by capital. One of the things that this whole issue of extremism raises is the double standards. And I think a lot of people have been made aware of that by the contrast between the way the police treated the invaders of the Capitol as opposed to the way they have treated protests against police brutality, against police murder. That has been something very important to bring out. And the one thing that I would want to add to that whole public debate is the fact that the kid gloves that the police applied in relative terms to the Capitol invaders are not just a matter of they're not being black, because not being black is not necessarily a protection, because in some of the environmental demonstrations, student demonstrations, demonstrations against NATO and so on, even predominantly Euro-American people have not been immune to receiving police mace and assault. I remember a picture of the police assaulting several women sitting in a circle at one of the environmental demonstrations. So we have to be very clear that the real issue is the class issue underlying this, and that the racial thing is a pretext in a way to avoid facing the class issue in a sense. Finally, the one other point that I would like to make, incidentally, and it's not really in contrast to any of the things you said, but just complementing it in a way, is that so much of the discussion that's now being carried on is around the domestic issues. And as the domestic issues, those are the ones in which Biden is being able to carve out a slightly different path from the previous administration. However, by contrast, in relation to foreign policy, we have an image of almost total continuity. And so we need to, in a way, that's in a way of saying we need to rebuild the peace movement. There hasn't been a visible peace movement for so long, and the peace movement draws our attention to the fact that foreign policy, and as we know, the foreign policy is the area of total ruling class consensus, and on which there's the least public discussion because there is so much of a consensus. So democratizing the discussion, democratizing the whole process means drawing foreign policy into the discussion. And I guess the most direct ways of doing so, which many people have recognized, of course, is to challenge the military budget, the militarism, and so on, and recognize that the undoing that whole military priority is really a kind of necessary condition for getting the kinds of progressive social policies that we're fighting for. Good, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Victor, so much for that, for broadening our perspective and also drilling down on some important issues here. Yeah, who are the extremists, right? And how do we link these, these surging domestic movements against police brutality and other racial injustice and radical inequity and to the pressing need for anti-imperialist, or as you call it, a peace movement? I mean, it seems to me, right, a truly global Black Lives Matter movement would have to talk a lot about the predominantly non-white bodies getting hit by all those drone strikes and occupied by all these military bases, and absolutely so profound. We actually have other great profound thinkers on this call right now. I'd like to call on two of them to offer questions or comments, and then we'll we'll definitely go back to our panel and Victor as well. I have Mark Soderstrom, also co-producer of Shelter and Solidarity, with a question, and then Mike after that. And I know we have Liz Mestres, formerly of the who's shaking her head at me, doesn't want to be put on the spot. We have some other great folks, Avi Chomsky, John Trumpauer, folks I know and folks I don't. But let's start with those who have actually volunteered, Mark and Mike.
Oh, thank you, Joe. I would really love to hear each of you sort of specifically address what you see as the future relationship between socialist organizations and organized labor, right? I mean, Joe Biden just came out for 15. Amazing, right? But is this a time where we want to put real energy and real commitment to things like the push for card check? Is this a time when we want to put real energy and make a center in our talking points some of the repeal of the limitations of Taft-Hartley? Is this an opportunity where we could actually redress that? And part of that is then also, how do we negotiate the relationship between so much of labor, organized labor nationally, and its commitment to centrist Democrats, right? Could we wean them away by actually taking real commitments in the interest of organized labor? And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Let's take one more before we kick it back. I'd like to try to get as many voices in as possible. Mike, are you still on the call?
Yes, I am. I'll try to be as concise as I can with this. Regarding, this is more of a comment that I'm just posing to, putting out there, and I'd like to hear from whoever wants to respond to it. Like starting with just the name, American Realities, I'm actually very pessimistic, because these American realities that the left is facing, or what the left has been facing for almost practically its entire existence in this country, almost. I mean, it might sound like an exaggeration, but it's really not. And it seems to me, even though I'm a supporter of it, that much of the social democratic left, and that's really what we're talking about here. We're not, that's the basic implementation that needs to happen before we're even really talking about socialism. Is for us to even get the kind of social democracy that's in Western Europe. Unfortunately, I don't see some of the more prominent elements of the social democratic left in this country being, particularly well positioned to face that. There's been, leaders in the BLM movement who've been claiming to kind of generally speak for, for Black and Indigenous, people of color. And then you see something like, and I'll post a link to it in the chat. There's a, Gallup poll from June and July of last year, where, 61% of Black Americans said they wanted the same amount of police presence in their neighborhoods. And then you see something like with DSA, which is an organization that I used to be in, that I have a lot of great respect for, and all the people who've been part of it are still part of it, Harrington, Cornel West, et cetera. When you have, Adolph Reed being silenced by the DSA, Afro-Socialist Caucus, and then, in the platform, you have Open Borders, which the Cato Institute loves and is, publishing comic books, endorsing now. And you also have police abolition as a part of the platform. That's something that, and then you have things like the spectacle of the 2019 National Convention. Well, if things continue in that direction, I'd say good luck with getting a lot of Americans of every ethnicity, of any, sex, whatever, on board. Obviously, we can be in our, urban enclaves and look at our DSA chapters or whatever, or, kind of social democratic organizations and be very happy. But what are the inroads that they're, really making in the 80% of the rest of the country? And I'd also agree with Victor Wallace. Pretty much every point he made, and Also regarding the peace movement, as somebody who started out in the peace movement, I'd say actually where I'm less pessimistic is, sorry, Victor Wallace. Has been a lot of action around, especially the civil war in Yemen, and identifying our role in that. And I was active in that before the plague struck us. And that's actually what I'll end with. I mean, in terms of like, we're talking about abolishing the police and everything, which I just think is, it's just not not something to even be toying with right now as concrete policy. And what do we really need right now? We need 3M. We need Biden to enact the Defense Production Act, and get 3M to start sending everyone N95 masks, because this virus is mutating. It's more transmissible. We've known it's been airborne for a while, and it's killing thousands and thousands of people. So I'd say that, and that right there, that's not even a socialist concern. I mean, that's just an existential concern. So I'll stop right there.
Okay, Mike, there's a lot in that comment. Just one thing I just wanted to just distill a little bit before we give it back to our panel. I mean, Mike's asking a lot, but I mean, the question of, how do we understand an abolitionist perspective on policing that can actually resonate outside of urban areas, and where the left may be stronger. Mark, I don't want his question to be lost, also asking about the opportunities or the necessities of engaging in the labor movement, both in terms of leadership and in terms of on the ground, the possibilities now for pushing for card check, union recognition, and pushing against some of the reactionary aspects of Taft-Hartley. I think but Mike's closing comment also brings up the issue of how, to the degree to which, even the so-called liberals, and let alone the Republicans, show themselves incapable of even running basic social services. And even Zizek put it once, I'll cite Zizek here: you can't depend on liberals to deliver the things that liberalism promises. You need a left to even get the things that liberals promise, because things have gone so far. That can, that's an opportunity, as well as some people would see it as a kind of a trap. What if the left does nothing but reproduce, what liberalism used to? But nonetheless, I think it's very important. I mean, a lot of what Mike says, I'm going to shut up here and just kick it back to the panel. So we have a question about the labor movement, and then a question about, can the social democratic movement really own its own promise and resonate beyond some of the places where the policing, the anti-policing movement has been most prominent. Wants to step in there? Kazembe, I know you mentioned an abolitionist perspective in some of your recent writings. I was listening or reading before the show. I don't know if you want to step into that. What does an abolitionist perspective mean to you, and how do you see it as conversant with a social democratic platform as well? I don't know.
I guess the thing about it is we can always go into these kind of debates around the difference between rural and urban, but I don't like to go into those debates, because I feel like that's the framing of the ruling class in a lot of ways. You know what I'm saying? And when you see where the Black rebellions have happened in places that were outside the urban areas. That happened in Ferguson. You know what I'm saying? They've happened in Baltimore. They've happened in middle America. They happened in Minnesota. Right. And so these are places where, actually, I'll make the argument that, places that are actually divorced from capital have the most potential in terms of rebellions, uprisings. I mean, we've seen chicken plant, we've seen wildcat strikes and chicken plants, around COVID and, all these different things. But I think the question for us is that, when these things happen, it's where do we support them, right? And how do we get this? So in large part, socialism, is always a learning experiment, right? I mean, the word socialism itself came from a printer, saying? So it's socialism has always been connected to literacy and learning and being able to learn. So how do we extend that and actually extend people's power? And in terms of abolition, I'm sorry, I shouldn't curse, but in terms of abolition, there's always been, I think the thing about it is when you talk about abolition, you always have to connect it to the fight around labor, and wage labor. So like, to me, you look at the first abolitionist moment was the Paris Commune, right? Saying the Commune, which this year, I think we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Commune, right? Was an attempt at, abolishing, and bringing to, law enforcement. So law enforcement, the pay of soldiers in the Parisian army was the same as bakers, right? And alongside that, what did they do? They abolished, like, night baking. Saying, what was night baking? Night baking was the fact that people had to bake through the night, and like, and produce bread for the Parisian masses. They abolished it. So why did they abolish it? So workers could have more free time, right? So they can go enjoy themselves. They can go have a good time and learn and be able to be literate, right? So this question around abolition has always been also connected to this question around, free time and literacy. And you see this also connected also in terms of, like, obviously, with the term, has lots of roots of, in terms of, the fight against chattel slavery in this country. So, I think that, there's ways in which, we have to be able to expand, the level in terms of the conversation. Certainly, there's a lot of, like, the differences between urban and rural. I'm not gonna deny that. But I think that is also going to be a question of, like, let's not deny the potential of rural communities to actually take leadership in this, what I'm saying? And I think that, we just saw, like, just in terms of, a basic social democratic conversation. We just saw Georgia go blue, so it's like, so there's this conversation around the potential of a new South that's really kind of interesting too. So I know that's a little bit jumbled up a little bit, but I wanted to say that term, and maybe just toss to someone else and to talk about a little bit about this, but also the question of labor and a little bit more too.
Yeah, thank you, Kazembe. Let's go to Liza or Eljeer. There's still a lot on the table. Mark's question about the labor movement, as well as many issues from Mike's comment. And then we're going to go to Karen for a next comment. Eljeer or Liza? How about Eljeer and then Liza?
Okay, all right, thank you. Well, I think Mark's question, I think, is probably one of the key questions, and that allows us to examine what is the state of the labor movement. This year, the AFL-CIO will have elections. Trump will be, I think, retiring, and he's already selected someone. And there's certainly a lot of talk around Sarah Nelson and the role that she's played, particularly in the years of Trump and the government shutdown and the calls for general strike. Labor organizing, particularly in the period of COVID, has been very interesting. From nurses protesting the lack of PPE, Amazon workers organizing in the warehouses, Google workers organizing a union. During the rebellion, the AFL-CIO building was vandalized. But what that building really represented, to me, that represented the fact, the irrelevancy of the AFL-CIO. And if it's gonna be serious, it's gonna have to look to organize the unorganized. It's going to have to break out of the comfort zone to which this idea and lead to an adversarial position than this question of junior partnership with capital. Because after Charlottesville, Trump was one of the last figures to leave Trump's economic council. While all the other CEOs left, Trump was the last one to do that. That's an embarrassment, and it says how far we've gone back. We've regressed with a more radical labor movement. And I think this period, you will find many young people who are doing that new organizing. And I would even argue that we need new unions to emerge, to really put the type of blowtorch to the fire, blowtorch to the feet of the labor bureaucracy that exists in this country at this historical moment, because the numbers are disastrous. It's very comparable to the 1920s in the sense of union density in a number of cities and states and regions of the country. The rise of the right wing really flows from the fact that the labor movement was unable to have the pitch battles against the bosses in the deindustrialized sectors of the U.S. economy. And so if the labor movement is to be revitalized, the socialist movement is going to have to play a vital role in this process. And I think we're seeing a lot of that new organizing coming from a lot of new socialist organizers, many of them in DSA. Many of our members in SA is also involved in new organizing here in New York, like Housing Works as one example. One of our members became the president of the Postdocs Union, one of the first postdocs unions to be established in the nation, in fact. So there's something brewing, but there's a lot that has to be done.
Yes, absolutely. Liza, you next. And I understand, Liza, I know you need to go shortly after 8:30. So I want to, this may be your closing comment as well. So if there's other points you'd like to make besides addressing the questions.
Well, no, I'm going to
round, though.
I'm going to stick to the question. Just I agree with Eljeer. There are a lot of exciting rank and file socialist labor organizing right now, and I'd add, I mean, I think during the pandemic was a great spark to a lot of that, surprisingly, given the difficult conditions of organizing. We're also seeing a lot of new labor organizing in media industries, my own industry, which is surprising to me and great, and also teachers. We're seeing, like, I mean, we've been seeing tremendous teacher organizing over the past few years, and certainly a lot recently. And as for, like, is the Biden administration a good time to make demands by the labor movement? Absolutely. I mean, it would be crazy to leave anything on the table. I mean, he just made some pretty decent moves at the NLRB and has centered the $15 minimum wage. We should not be satisfied with any of that. I mean, like just the fact that he made these moves so early on should be taken by the labor movement and the left as an opportunity to press for much more. And so I'd say yes to that. And as for the the sort of, we always get that criticism that socialism is only making progress in these urban bubbles. Well, a few years ago we weren't even doing that, so I think that, like, a lot has happened recently. But second of all, I mean, people would say, oh, these urban progressive bubbles, like, we couldn't even get a city council person, I mean, like in 2015. So this is like, so, like, a lot has changed, and urban bubbles, as have already been said, are also bubbles of intense capitalist power. So, they're not necessarily that much easier to do places to do socialist organizing. But I would say the rural areas of this country are very rife for socialist organizing. I interviewed a number of socialist organizers in Tennessee recently, and they were, I mean, the conditions that people live under, I mean, if you get sick in parts of rural Tennessee, you cannot get to a hospital because our for-profit system doesn't find it profitable to have a hospital in these very low population areas. So you have to have helicopter insurance in case you get sick, because a helicopter is the ambulance. The helicopter is the only way that you are going to get to the hospital. So if you are a poor person in parts of rural Tennessee, you have to pay for helicopter insurance. Of course, most people cannot afford helicopter insurance in addition to all the other expenses of their lives. So, I mean, just the basic vanilla social democracy that many of us are demanding in the form of things like single payer healthcare, as the comrades in Tennessee have pointed out, has tremendous potential and sounds pretty good to a lot of people. So I wouldn't underestimate it, and I would not make too much of the way some people try to frame things as culture war issues. I'd also say that I mean, in the form of police abolition, I think there's also there's a real analogy between how Victor Wallace spoke so eloquently about defunding the military and its connection to socialist priorities. I mean, we're seeing a lot of people starting to speak of defunding the police in similar kinds of ways, that rather than investing in violence against our people, let's invest in our people. I mean, and that's in what we have actually so a slate of socialist city council people running very strong defund the police platforms, and it's not simply an anti-police agenda, it's also an agenda for socializing those resources into things that the community really needs. So just to throw that out there, I think there's a parallel there.
So many great points. I mean, I'm recalling from Liza's comment something that Terry Eagleton wrote, the Marxist literary critic, but he's also chimed in on a lot of other issues. And he said basically, to be a socialist revolutionary, you just have to take the radical position that everyone on Earth deserves indoor plumbing. Like, that's it. Like, because in order to achieve that minimal basis of human dignity, to really take that seriously. The key thing is to make it universal. To not have anyone locked out of that basic thing would require revolutionizing so many systems that are currently, dominant or normalized. And I just think, so there's no doubt there's the basis for socialist organizing. I guess the question is of how we can actually devote resources and cultivate the political lines that can bring that possibility, or help contribute to the fruition of that possibility. We have two, I mean, I don't want to shut anything down. I know we're at 8:30 and you may have to go, Liza. So if you do, I want to say thank you for being here. That I'm not asking anyone else to leave, but we told folks this would go till 8:30. We do sometimes go till 9 with group discussion, but Liza, it's been wonderful having you here. If you are,
I do. Thank you so much, everybody. It was really a great pleasure to talk with all of you.
Great, thank you, Liza, and we'll check out your next piece in Jacobin or The Nation or whatever. Keep in touch. We have two folks in the queue, and I'd like to get those voices in, and then give Eljeer and Kazembe chances for closing remarks, maybe Victor as well. First, we have Karen, and then we have Seren, one of the co-producers of Shelter in Solidarity.
Thanks, Joe. This is Karen Pomerantz, and I appreciate this time. I'll make it brief. I think the things that we discussed, like abolition and anti-imperialism policies, can really only be accomplished if we have state power. And I just think it's kind of naive to think that we could elect those things in. And really that requires a massive movement. It requires a communist movement and a communist party to actually organize that. And it requires a fight against racism to bring people together. So it may seem pretty naive or crazy, we're naive to think that we can use electoral politics to win this. I think we can use electoral politics and the DSA to meet people who are interested in building such a movement, to fight for things like universal toilets or healthcare, or whatever we really need on a global basis, not to mention vaccines. So I think that, we need to extend the envelope of what we're fighting for. And I think that really requires a communist movement, and to learn from the mistakes in the past so we can do it better this time. So that's basically what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Well said. Seren?
I had any number of questions in mind, including addressing the question that Victor raised around Facebook, a question around Michael Passerini's comments about social democracy. And I do want to make a short comment on that before asking my question, which I think is one that's going to be consistent with Karen's question or point. I just want to observe that social democracy is really an outcome, sometimes an unintended outcome of very vigorous socialist movements pushing for something, especially in Western Europe, in the context of a global rival to capitalism, and also in the context of movements that want something much more powerful than the actual social democracy that they ended up with. And so I don't think you end up with social democracy by asking for social democracy. So just want to leave that point there. And I think that's the way we have to think about things like open borders and abolishing the police. But my question is the following. Both Socialist Alternative and DSA have pursued genuinely national strategies, albeit by engaging in local races and state assemblies and that kind of thing. Another strategy inaugurated in 2013, the same year that Sharma Sawant is elected, was that implemented by the folks around Corporation Jackson and with the election of Chokwe Lumumba, which involves an electoral component, but is also very strongly connected to a grassroots solidarity economy movement, a cooperative movement. And these are not localist movements, although they pursue their strategy at a local level. And so in some respects, their strategy is about building a base in regions that capitalism has chosen to forget about, and where the proletariat has been removed from the workplace and now exists as uses for capitalism for either symbolic reasons or as consumers. What about these other strategies pursued by Corporation Jackson, by Corporation Humboldt? I'm sure that Kazembe and Eljeer both can speak to that. Thanks.
Thank you, Seren. Thank you, Karen. And of course, I would just add that, of course, Seren's point about building base areas where there's been capitalist abandonment could also be seen in an international context, right, where there's a history of that sort of organizing as well. Eljeer, and then Kazembe, and then Victor.
Okay. Well, I think when we think of certainly the abolish the police, abolish prisons, in some ways that's a very important step forward in the sense of the imagination of young activists, of young organizers trying to imagine a world where the carceral state doesn't exist. Right? What's lacking with that imagination is understanding. I think, as Karen pointed out, is you can't abolish the police or prisons without understanding you have to abolish capitalism. You have to abolish imperialism because they go hand in hand. Its birth really is a simultaneous process to defend, to protect the power, the prestige, and the private property of the ruling class, of the ruling elite, not only in the United States, but around the world. And so the question of a mass movement, but a sustaining mass movement that has leadership, that has organization, that is in every segment of where the working class lives, where they eat, where they sleep, is going to be absolutely crucial. And I think the left, if it's going to politically mature and develop, it's going to have to be able to speak to the working class and have that dialogue and have even arguments, even around police in the community itself. And so the idea of community control over police is something that doesn't come up too often. And certainly in the Seattle, in our work in Seattle and Sharma's council office, we advanced that type of demand to really talk about what does community control of police, but also what does community control over public safety looks like. It's not just the idea of getting rid of the police alone, but to deal with the fundamental issues that cause levels of criminality, that cause levels of social decay. And so that's something that I think has to be part of this conversation. I think we have to fight for the question of the reforms. That's very important. We fight for it in a militant way, but the only way that we can sustain those reforms is with a political, economic, and social alternative. I would argue, and I think Karen is right again, that the question of socialist alternative is on the agenda, has to be put on the agenda. Certainly, how do we get there? And so the component that has been missing for the United States working class is the question of its own political organ, its own political organization, its own political party. I mean, when I became political in the early 1990s, I joined Socialist Alternative. At that time, it was called Labor Militant, and we were part of a project called the Labor Party, which was stillborn many years ago because it wouldn't run candidates. It wouldn't really challenge the oligarchy and really challenge the two-party system, particularly the Democratic Party. But nonetheless, that gave us a semblance of what a social democratic party would look like within the United States, within the context of the United States. And that's why the Sanders phenomenon defeats, both in 2016 and 2020, is so disheartening. I mean, today we talk about the meme and he's at the inauguration and his little brown mittens. That's all cute and that's all well and good. But it says something, it's almost like sticking their finger in the eye of so many Sanders supporters, so many progressives that saw that moment, what Sanders represented for a new generation, that as I think as the brother was pointing out, Michael was pointing out, that he was maybe one of the rare politicians, public figures that could speak to the working class, that could speak to the multiracial working class, that can go to Trump land, can talk to the Trump supporters and say that the reason why you're going through the crisis you're going through, it's not because LGBTQIA plus people have rights or Black folks have rights or immigrants have rights, but in fact, Wall Street is dominating your life. Wall Street caused a foreclosure crisis. Wall Street has put more cops on the street than any other time in US history. And so when he conceded, in some ways, he conceded an element of the imagination of transforming the kind of the American landscape at this juncture. But what I say in my closing is this: what Sanders said, that is not me, it's us. I think a new generation is serious about that. And so even without Sanders, a new generation is going to say it's about us. It's about getting a world where there is no poverty, there's no greed, there's no environmental destruction. And in fact, only we, working people, the poor and the oppressed around the world, can provide the type of workers' democracy, not just bourgeois democracy, not just empty democracy, but workers' democracy, where working people have direct control over their lives. And that to me is a very powerful indication. And so Corporation Jackson, I think in many respects, is a very important snapshot of another political economic alternative. But once again, if it's still within the confines of American capitalism, under the market rules, they're going to have trouble. They're going to have issues that will be dominated by the corporate elements of the Democratic Party, by the elements of the market forces, particularly on the question of worker co-ops. And so this is a serious question. I support and I applaud Corporation Jackson, but I do say at the same time that in order for us to have a Corporation Jackson in a real sense, that ultimately you're going to have to raise the question of socialist transformation of society, where working people really have political, economic, and social power in their hands collectively, not only the United States, but around the world.
Yeah, thank you, Eljeer. Really a lot to process there on a number of key points. Kazembe and Victor, I'd love to get both your thoughts. I don't know if one of you would rather go before the other. Kazembe, let's go you, and then Victor has responded.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess a couple of things for me. I think that when we think about, the question that Seren kind of brings up, I think about it in two ways. I think about one is that you need to develop dual power. You need to develop like ways in which like people are able to engage in building a base, directly, and actually like, and have a hand in actually ruling society. You know what I'm saying? And so that means that also like, so the question around cooperatives, is also a question of like building up that muscle for folks can actually have, institutional memory and be able to think about ruling society, right, and ruling democratically. And I think another part of it too, and I think this is something that's really important, is about the resocialization of our people. Our people have gone through so much in terms of this, like, kind of the selfish nature of capitalism. People are so isolated, and the kind of the worst thing around this particular COVID-19 situation is that folks are more like folks have been super isolated from each other. Which makes it even more amazing that people have been protesting. It makes it even more amazing that sometimes that you see things like mutual aid societies develop, in different cities around the country. And some of these mutual aid, spaces, have been politicized, and many people are, joining socialist movements within that. But I think it's important that, the work of cooperatives, the work of developing these like kind of like alternative forms of not just, they're not just retreats, but they're actually like kind of like, kind of challenging, like actual capital by actually having a space where people can actually exercise democratic control. And, and I think that for myself, I mean, like, this work is very humbling to me. Someone mentioned communism. I don't know, like, Frida Kahlo, Paul Robeson, Albert Einstein, Lenin, Trotsky, a whole host of people, saying were on our side. Saying, and capitalism still won, right? And saying, and like, and I think that one of the things that I draw from that particular time is that there are a lot of lessons to be learned. I think that, there's a lot of things that we need to develop and also learn, put together. And I think that, but I think that, what the brother said, it's not about me, it's us. And I think that that level of coming together in unity is super important right now, because, it's not going to be just one person. It's going to be a bunch of us who have to come together, saying, so like, I try to take this work in as humble as possible. I think it's important that, you do the work of like, being a leader in terms of like, leading people in terms of like, teaching people how to read, developing political literacy, developing political sensibilities, organize yourself out of a job, and like, and center like the leadership of the people who are most marginalized and oppressed so they can be able to take power. And I think that we have a very rich tradition that we stand on. So I think that, like with all that, I mean, I think there's a lot more, brighter days ahead. But I think that, we because we've learned the lessons that we need to learn. And I think that, I think Elijah, you touched on this too. The kids today are much hipper than we were before. They know a lot. And I think that the kind of like, it's like Scooby-Doo when they trying to take the mask off, what I'm saying, the head. And you see it like, and the kids like, they took the mask off their head. Like, all the kids know is capitalism. You know what I'm saying? So I think a lot of times you have more of these kids who are more hip than I was when I was growing up. And so I take a lot of leadership from them as well.
Yeah, thank you, Kazembe. I mean, I think this emphasis on the need to and the possibility for incubating and cultivating people's capacities, right, in both directions, and not in some top-down way, right, but the way in which the need. I mean, sometimes I talk about the need to not just overthrow capital, but overgrow it too, right? That we need to be nourishing the capacities of people to not only be read, but like Mao and company said, read and expert. You know what I mean too? Like we need to like. And maybe, I think maybe we should do a show on co-ops and the possibilities, are co-ops just like, fight, I mean, how does socialism and co-op, cooperatives work together in the history of that? And it might be great to build on this discussion, following up on some of those projects and some of those experiments that some of you have been involved in. Victor, I'd like to give you something like a last word reflection. No pressure again, but I'd love another respondent comment, and then I'll just make an announcement about our next show, and we'll wrap up for tonight. I think we're almost to 9 o'clock.
Yeah, I mean, so many important considerations have been raised already, but one way I think I would sum it up is by saying that state power is not an all or nothing matter. That even if one gets it all at once, so to speak, as happened, let's say, in 1917 in the Bolshevik Revolution, that's not a complete conquest of society, because all the old habits were still present in so many ways And when they had to rely on experts from the old capitalist class, as Lenin said in 1918, this was a concession. It meant that although they had the reins of the state, that was not a complete transformation. And so different dimensions of the totally needed transformation can be accomplished at different times. And so what's just been said about the importance of building cooperatives, developing talents, developing the capacities to rule is one part of it. And we're witnessing different examples of approaches to the conquest of power in different countries, even as we speak. So in Venezuela, for example, a movement or a political force with a commitment to socialism did get into the position of state, let's say state authority, state office, but because of imperialism, it was not in a position to exercise complete state power. So there are so many different dimensions of transformation that have to be accomplished in order for it to be complete. And each one of them has its merits and its virtues, and we can have endless discussions about what should come first. But I think we need to recognize that it's not a question of just taking state power all at once. It's a question of developing the movement, and that has to be done in accordance with the possibilities that are available in each country. And I think in terms of the United States, the objective conditions have been addressed in a quite representative way in the discussion we've had tonight, and it gives us something to build on.
Yeah. Thank you, Victor. I think that is a really reflective closing comment to a discussion that needs to continue. I mean, the idea of shelter and solidarity is precisely designed, or our hope, to create a space off of social media where comrades and friends and new folks can come together and get into some of these deep and pressing questions in an accessible way. So pleased to have you with us tonight, Kazembe, Eljeer, and Victor, and shout out to Liza and to all of you who spoke or contributed to the chat, or who are just here to listen. We hope this conversation will resonate and continue, not only when we come back in 2 weeks with our next show, Thursday nights every other week